Let me tell you about this one night at the pub I work at. It was a typical Wednesday evening, nothing too special, just the regulars and a few new faces here and there. Wednesdays are pub quiz nights, and we usually get a good mix of people, students, locals, and the occasional know-it-all who thinks they're the next Einstein. This particular night, we had a guy come in who was the epitome of arrogance. He strutted into the pub like he owned the place, his chest puffed out and a smug grin plastered across his face. He couldn't have been more than 35, wearing a crisp button-down shirt that screamed, "I'm better than you." Let's call him Mr. Ego. Mr. Ego made his way straight to the bar where I was working. He ordered a pint and started chatting me up, but it wasn't the friendly kind of chit-chat. It was more like he was trying to impress me with every word that came out of his mouth. "You know, I've got an IQ of 140, he boasted, taking a swig of his beer. "I'm probably the smartest person in this entire pub." Now, I've heard my fair share of tall tales from tipsy patrons, but this guy was really laying it on thick. He went on and on about his impressive academic achievements, his high-profile job, and how he was only in this quaint little city for some big conference at the university. I just nodded along, trying to be polite, but internally rolling my eyes. As the night wore on, more people trickled in for the quiz. Our usual teams were there, the brainiacs, the old-timers, and a few student groups. Then there was Mr. Ego, sitting alone at the bar with an air of superiority that could have filled the entire room. He kept glancing around, probably sizing up the competition and finding them lacking. When it was time for the quiz to start, Mr. Ego made a big show of moving to a table closer to the quizmaster. He wanted to make sure everyone could see and hear him. He made some snide comments about the other teams, calling them bumpkins and retired old farts who had nothing better to do. It was clear he was here to win and wasn't going to let anyone forget it. I decided to join the quiz myself, just for the fun of it. I named my team Bumpkin as a little inside joke. I figured I'd play along with Mr. Ego's narrative and see where it took us. The quiz kicked off, and the first few rounds went by without much incident. Mr. Ego was scribbling furiously on his answer sheet, looking more and more frustrated with each passing question. Meanwhile, the usual suspects were doing their thing. The old-timers, with their decades of accumulated trivia knowledge, were holding their own. The student teams were chattering away, debating answers, and having a good time. And there I was, quietly tapping away on my phone, entering answers under the moniker Bumpkin. Halfway through the quiz, the scores were announced. The old-timers were in the lead, followed by the brainiacs, and then a few student teams. Mr. Ego was nowhere near the top. His name didn't even crack the top 10. He looked like he'd been slapped in the face with a wet fish. His cheeks flushed red, and he started muttering under his breath about the questions being too easy or too obscure. The final round came, and it was a tough one. Even the regulars were struggling, but they were having fun with it, laughing and joking around. Mr. Ego, on the other hand, was visibly seething. He was scribbling so hard I thought he might tear through his answer sheet. When the last question was answered, everyone waited in anticipation for the final scores. The quizmaster went through the results, starting from the bottom. Mr. Ego's name came up somewhere around 15th place. The look on his face was priceless, pure shock and indignation. He couldn't believe he'd been beaten by a bunch of bumpkins and old retired fuck-ups. I had to stifle a laugh as the quizmaster continued up the list. Finally, the top 3 were announced. The old-timers took first place, the brainiac second, and a group of students third. And me? Well, Bumpkin had managed to snag a respectable 5th place. Mr. Ego was fuming. He stormed up to the quizmaster, demanding a recount and accusing him of rigging the quiz. The quizmaster, an experienced pro at dealing with disgruntled quizzers, calmly told Mr. Ego that the scores were final and that maybe he should brush up on his trivia before making such bold claims. Mr. Ego wasn't having any of it. He threw his answer sheet down in a huff and stormed out of the pub, muttering curses under his breath. As the door swung shut behind him, the entire pub burst into laughter. The old-timers raised their glasses in a toast, and one of them shouted, "Here's to the bumpkins." It was a perfect end to the evening. Mr. Ego had come in with all the swagger in the world, but he left with his tail between his legs, thoroughly humbled by a bunch of bumpkins and old retired fuck-ups. That night became the stuff of pub legend. Every time someone new came in with a bit too much confidence, we'd remind them of Mr. Ego and how he got his comeuppance. It was a sweet reminder that no matter how smart you think you are, there's always someone out there who can bring you back down to earth. And sometimes, that someone is just a humble bumpkin with a phone and a good sense of humor.